So I'm with Dan Lowe, and I heard years ago from him a story about something that interested me, and then I had it verified, the same story from another source, and so I just want you to talk about that, if you will, Dan, about the underground city, the tunnels, and things like that in the Henry Mountains. And with that, take it away.
Okay. I heard a long time ago a story about it, and it's probably the story that I'm going to tell later in concerning the Henrys, but I don't know, back then it just didn't fit into my agenda or whatever, but it was rekindled when I and Rick, who didn't make it, he was supposed to be here, and a few others were down on the Arizona Strip, sitting around the campfire after a day of searching for things that we'll talk about in another interview. And there was an awful lot of beer being drank that night. Not so much myself, because I'm just not much of a drinker. But one individual brought a little bit of moonshine from Colorado. And when you mix the two together, people have a tendency to start talking. And I need to be careful with this, because this individual is a good friend of mine, and I don't want to get him in trouble. But we were talking about underground cities, and particularly the one down in the Grand Canyon and a couple other locations, one in which had to do with why we were camping there. And one individual started telling us about a place in the Henry Mountains that, according to the sources, existed an underground city big enough to house 50,000 people.
Sounds like a Grand Canyon story, the Egyptians in the Grand Canyon story.
Yeah. And this individual didn't go in this, but he was helping some friends to locate it, and when they found it, I'll leave the details out, but he was standing there looking at two 9-foot stone doors. I know everybody out there is going to think, well, why didn't he open them? Well, because there was water leaking through the top of the door. And he knew that if he tried to open them doors, that he was going to end up in one of the many drainages that heads to the Grand Canyon. I know this individual very well, and I find him to be one of the most credible people I've ever known in this game. To give further validation, as he stood there and looked at these two 9-foot stone doors, examining how they were constructed and such, they had a certain type of a hinge that helped the doors to swing one way or the other. And he noticed off to the side that what was more than likely a hinge that had been replaced. He took that home with him. It's still at his house.
A metal hinge? What kind of a hinge?
No, there was no metal hinges. These were rock fashioned. Yeah.
Okay.
I have yet to see it, but it's there. Anyway, of course, this piqued our interest, and after this particular night, months later, because of another story that we had come across, we started asking questions. And unfortunately, he's one of those individuals that when you make an oath, you stick to it, and he's not one that's going to violate that oath. And so all we really had to go on was some of the finer details that he gave us while he was mixing the two substances. Since then, I found a story about a Paiute woman who, her and her friend were following up on a story that had been handed down from her grandfathers down in the Henrys. And it had to do with the entrance to an underground city and what they called as a snake temple. In the story, they said that the temple had been destroyed and covered and buried to keep people out of it. Whether or not this ties in with my buddy's story or not, I don't know. I'm quite certain it does, but probably not the same entrance. The woman, at one time when she was down there, was sitting on the side of the road near a certain spring, and she saw a massive snake come up out of the ground. And I'll spare the details because they're vague in my mind, but the things I remember is that she said the snake's head was bigger than her own. The length of the snake was at least 28 feet. It had some sort of a dorsal fin on the back of its head. And that it wasn't like most snakes with scales. It was more of a leathery skin. And the man who was down there with her, he also commented on a couple of events where he had witnessed some of these massive, very large snakes. One in which he saw attack a calf that was at the spring getting a drink of water, and he stayed back in the trees in amazement while he watched this snake wrap this calf up and eat it. And you know, some of these stories, they reach a point where I even have a hard time believing them. Today, I would have to say that I lean a little more towards the possibility that something definitely happened. I know where this spring is, or at least I believe I do. I found a couple of, not objects, but structures, I guess, down in this general area. I was going through some old aerial photography, and there was a couple things that just stuck out like a sore thumb, and so I decided to pull up some of the newer imagery and Google Earth and USGS maps, and there's definitely something there, and pretty sure it's man-made. Whether or not there is a city, underground city, large enough to house 50,000 people, who knows? But the Henry Mountains in this particular area has definitely got my interest. We've spent, I don't know, we had at least a dozen trips down there in the last couple of years, and we really wanted to get down there in the fall, but wasn't able to get down there, and we have certain reasons why we would like to be there at certain times of the year. But I've never seen anything that shows that there's large snakes, snake scat, snake skin, anything like that. But I have a friend who has seen some very large snake skins down in this general area. They certainly weren't 28 feet long, but they were very large snake skin. I don't know what more I can
So an interesting
say about it.
thing to me is I had a guy contact me just not too long ago, told me basically the same story about how there was a woman, Indian lady watching this and about a snake thing, and whether this person heard that story from you or it's coming from a different story. Somebody else hearing it from, I can't remember exactly what it was. That's interesting, and man, if there's an underground city with ancient things, I want to look for that.
Well, I'm pretty sure I haven't told anybody about that.
Somebody else just told me that story, just here the last couple of weeks.
I'm thinking back whether I ever wrote an article about it. I may have, but if I did, I would have removed it. Because I have a friend involved, and you know, I don't have any oath as far as this goes, but I know he does, and I really don't want to put him in a position where he becomes untrustworthy to his friends who shared this with him. So there's too many of these stories and too many good valid stories out there to give it away, if you know what I mean. I mean, let it be one of those things that just makes you say, there's things about it that's caught my attention, and I'll definitely be going back down just so I can see if I'm right or if I'm wrong.
Okay, and with that said, Dan, that's a wrap.